Well, good morning, everyone on the West Coast at Stanford University. Good afternoon to those of us joining from the East Coast, and good middle of the night if you are logging in from Taiwan or elsewhere in Asia. I am Kara Stempelman. I'm the program manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region here at the Hoover Institution. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our featured event. We have with us today Dr. Philip C. Saunders from National Defense University in Washington, D.C., who is joining us for a talk entitled Crossing the Strait, PLA Modernization and Taiwan. Now, before I turn the floor over to Dr. Saunders, I did want to say a couple of words about this talk. I'm delighted to have Dr. Saunders as what I think is one of the foremost experts. Certainly, he has extensive and long experience thinking about the PLA's Taiwan problem. He has written several books on the PLA and its modernization. The most recent is just about to come out. And so this talk actually doubles as kind of a pre-book tour, shall we say. The new book, Crossing the Strait, Taiwan's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan, is co-authored with several other people. Dr. Saunders will draw from that today in his talk. I also want to note, Dr. Saunders has worked on this topic for over 20 years, and so like myself, we got interested in Taiwan before it was cool, and so it's a delight to have someone who's thought about this long and hard over a long period of time and can reflect a little bit on the history and in particular address the question of whether the PLA's modernization has really accelerated or changed in its nature or character over the last few years as tensions across the Taiwan Strait have risen. Before I turn it over, I also did want to mention this is a hybrid event. We have some people in the room with us today, but we want to extend our welcome to our much larger audience online. And we want to encourage you to ask questions using the box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A there. I'll be fielding those questions as they come in. And I'll try to moderate and throw a few of those over to Dr. Saunders in the second half of our hour here. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Phil. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here today and with those who are here with us virtually. I have to start by saying these are my personal views drawn partly from the book, not those of NDU, DoD, or the US government, although they ought to listen to what I say more than they do. And I also have to say, so thanks to Karas and Hoover for bringing me here. I have to say it sort of feels like professional misconduct to give a talk based on a book that you don't have the book and you don't even have the cover for it. But then I realized I'm in Silicon Valley. I gave a version of this talk yesterday. That was the beta. And what you guys are getting is the release candidate version of the talk and the book. So the book will be out in hopefully by the end of the month online and in hard copy shortly after that. And I'm going to try to draw on it. So this was kind of my own take, but a lot of it is drawn from parts of the book by a range of authors, some of whom are even more expert and go into even more detail than I do. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into this. The next slide. Oh, I guess I control. So I'm going to talk a little bit about political context to set the scene. I'll go through the PRC military options for dealing with Taiwan. The bulk of what I'm going to try to do is talk about the reforms and modernization on the PLA's ability to actually execute those military options, give you some of the key findings from the book. You got to talk about Ukraine if you do Taiwan, so I will do that a little bit, and then wrap up with what I see sort of near-term and longer-term challenges. So that's our agenda for today. And it's important to know the details and the facts of the policy. So there's a sense in which this is the outcome of an unended Chinese civil war that focused on defeating the KMT and liberating Taiwan. The PLA wasn't able to do that because of US military intervention and then the US alliance. But with the opening of China, that provided a new set of opportunities. So China has articulated the one China principle that you know that says Taiwan's part of China. PRC is the sole voice for China internationally, refuses to accept the legitimacy of the Taiwan government or deal with it directly. It tries to isolate China internationally and force countries to choose one or the other. That was fine. That was the KMT's policy early on. But the net result of that and the US normalization of relations is a Taiwan that's isolated internationally, and the PRC that's the main representative of China in the international community. So that's kind of the broad overview. I want to hit just the note on the evolution of China's policy. In conjunction with opening up and reform, a lot of things changed in China under Deng Xiaoping. One of them was the policy toward Taiwan changed. And so it shifted to an emphasis on peaceful unification. The PRC started to think, well, we don't have to necessarily take it over through force of arms. We can make an offer. And they offered a lot of assurances about what Taiwan could keep under the one country, two systems model, but at the same time refused to rule out the use of force and encouraged economic ties and people to people's contacts across the strait, which has grown over time and been more formalized over time. But a remarkable thing in thinking about it is the policy guidelines set by 1982, in place by 1982, the PRC has stuck to that. The same principles, the same approaches that Deng Xiaoping articulated are all still in place despite major changes in China, major changes in Taiwan. They haven't altered it very much at all. And to their detriment, because more flexibility might be a more effective policy. But they keep focused on preventing Taiwan independence. That's, when Xi Jinping gets out of the bed in the morning, he has to make sure Taiwan doesn't go independent. Achieving unification is the ultimate goal, but not an ultimate goal that necessarily has to be achieved today or tomorrow. Chinese analysts and leaders view military means as critical for preventing independence. That's why they're not going to give them up, and useful for achieving unification. But that's sort of the burden of this talk, is to show that that's not so simple as it seems. Status quo is unacceptable as a permanent solution to the PRC. They call that sometimes permanent separation, which is akin to de facto independence. And there's an increasing emphasis evident in Chinese policy on planning for and achieving unification. Now, it was one thing when the KMT was in charge in China. They had a similar view. Eventually, they were going to go back and take over the mainland, and Taiwan's part of China. And there was actually a lot of policy parallelism. They just differed in who was supposed to be in charge. But I think democratization in Taiwan's really changed things a lot. It's made Taiwan's policy more responsive to the wishes of the public, including the majority of the population born on Taiwan. And with that, you have trends in society that now the government policy reflects. So an increasing sense of a separate Taiwan identity, or Taiwan and Chinese identity, declining interest in unification. That one country, two systems model has very little appeal in Taiwan, especially after the PRC crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. But what you get is a conditional preference. You might want unification, but not if it's going to lead to war. So what you get, and it's evident in the opinion polls, is a preference for the status quo, just because declaring independence and prompting a war that devastates Taiwan doesn't sound like a very attractive choice. One of the interesting things in doing this book and trying to draw the big picture conclusions is that Chinese policy has been relatively constant, but it reacts based on the perception of the opportunities and challenges posed by particular Taiwan leaders. And that shapes the tactical mix of leverage or coercion, united front tactics, and persuasion. This is my chapter in the book. I cut it out of the talk, killed me to do it, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if we have time. And a preliminary finding here is that the status quo is more stable than it seems, because Taiwan's not going to do something stupid that precipitates a conflict, and the PRC hasn't yet given up hope on peaceful unification. So there's a little more stability there than it sometimes seems. I want to talk a little bit about deterrence in the PRC calculus. So your preference for peaceful unification, I think that's real. if only for tactical reasons that military solutions have really high political, economic, and military costs and risks. They continue to exercise patience to put their faith in the Taiwan people in pursuing unification. And if we think about what that deterrence calculus looks like, it means making sure PRC leaders believe the costs and risks of using force outweigh the perceived benefits. And you have to also think about the perceived cost of inaction. If you do nothing and you get an independent Taiwan, if you do nothing and lose the chance for unification, that might prompt you to take action when you consider that, if those are unacceptable outcomes. And I want to highlight that because we sometimes talk about this solely in military terms. I think deterrence is a broader concept. You have to have that political element. And part of that, my view, is to keep the possibility of peaceful unification alive, to keep China thinking about peaceful unification and persuasion side of its policy rather than thinking the only way this thing is going to get done is with military means. And for Taiwan, this means not ruling out unification under the right circumstances, even if you're not really interested in it. Don't take the option off the table. For the US, I think this means keeping the focus on process rather than outcomes, whether the US will accept unification or not. Okay, so that a little bit on deterrence. I want to move to Chinese military options. So what they're doing now is gray zone coercion. So that's military pressure short of lethal force, using incursions into China's air defense, Taiwan's air defense identification zone, deployments around the island, amphibious exercises with a big map of Taiwan on the screen, and a variety of reasons, trying to deter Taiwan independence, improve readiness, demonstrate capabilities both to the world and to people at home, staying under that threshold for lethal force, and sowing doubts about US ability and resolve to intervene. I think here the point is there's more China can do in this realm. There's more pressure they could do, the things they could do like seize offshore islands. But the problem they have is this kind of pressure is not likely to be decisive in forcing Taiwan to the negotiating table. Okay, well, what can you do more than that? So there's three campaigns that the PLA writes about, talks about, trains for, and prepares for. We've got a great chapter in the book by Mike Casey that goes into tremendous detail from PLA military writings about this and what they look like in practice. I'm only going to scratch the surface. One of those is what they call a joint fire strike campaign. So this is essentially missiles and air bombardment. You can do it through multiple means that the PLA has available. You can target command and control, leadership, their intelligence systems, their command and control systems. The advantage is that it makes use of PRC military advantages, and you can scale the target, you can scale the campaign to what you want to do. The problem is this is absolutely lethal force. There's no way you're going to do this without killing people. You get the international reactions from it, civilian casualties, but it's not clear that it's a decisive campaign. You can certainly do damage to Taiwan. You can do considerable damage to Taiwan. But the history of countries under bombardment is it tends to unify and rally the population and encourage resistance. So you do this, you pay a fair amount of the cost, you don't necessarily get what you want if you are the PRC. Another option is a joint blockade campaign. We sometimes think about this as ships, outside ports interdicting stuff. The PLA has something in mind that's a little rougher than that. So there's different variants they talk about. One is an information blockade, cutting off the internet, cutting off comms. And oh, by the way, the internet runs through Shanghai. So the PRC can cut that cable if it wants to. But it's also ships, it's Coast Guard, it's strikes on the ports. So you take out the container facilities. That helps your blockade quite a lot if you can no longer load containers. You could frame it as law enforcement. You can use maritime advantage. But I think, again, the problem is you get that same, you're killing people, and that's on TV. You get international condemnation. It allows time, because if you think how a blockade works, it strangles a society, and the costs build over time as you're cut off for things. So it has to take time to have the political effects you want. That means it's time for the international community to respond, for the United States military to respond. And that means it might not be decisive. So that's a drawback with this. And then the third campaign is what's called a joint island landing campaign. And this is the full all-out invasion. You could do it against small islands, and we can talk about that if you want. But really, the big campaign is amphibious invasion, airborne campaign to try to occupy Taiwan. And the big advantage there is if you can do that, if you can win this campaign, that is conclusive. You have control of the island, you can impose your preferred political solution on it. The challenges are absolutely this gets international pressure and condemnation. It's a tough thing to do, as we'll talk a little bit more. You risk direct military conflict with the United States if it intervenes. So it's a tough thing to do. And let me show some of the challenges. One of the big ones is lift. If you look at this in detail, how do you get across that body of water that is the Taiwan Strait? And their organic military sea lift can only take half of the 6 amphibious brigades that the Army operates. Military airlift can only deliver a single PLA Air Force Airborne Corps brigade. So your organic lift is quite limited. That's a big problem for an invasion. Difficult landing conditions. There's only certain times of the year you can do this. There's only certain beaches you can go into. And that means it's pretty obvious where you're going to be coming. So that's an advantage for the defender. And then lack of experience, and especially joint experience. The PLA hasn't conducted large-scale combat since the Vietnam offensive in 1979. And they've expressed doubts about the quality of their commanders, and certainly they don't have experience doing joint operations. So these are some of the challenges that they would face. What are they doing about it? So I'm going to talk a little bit here about shifts in the military balance and reforms going on in the PLA. For a long time, China had the advantage of geography. That moat between it and China was really important, and it had a technological edge based on access to U.S. weapons and training. But I think that's eroded with PLA modernization. They've caught up technologically, and they have a lot more quantitatively and qualitatively. So that's the balance that's moved decisively against Taiwan. And even in the US-China balance, I think the US still enjoys a lot of advantages, especially in a long conflict where we can bring everything we have to bear on it. But it's absolutely true that Chinese investments in advanced conventional systems, anti-access area denial systems like an anti-ship ballistic missile or an effective surface-to-air missile network, and counter space and cyber really raise the costs and risks for US military. And the closer we get to China, the more you're exposed to all of those systems, the more risk you're taking on. I think the net assessment of that is US conventional advantage has eroded. The closer we get to Taiwan, the harder it is to fight there. And that's what's going on in the US military now, is thinking, how do we adapt our weapons? How do we adapt our operating concepts to fight the PLA effectively in that kind of an anti-access area denial environment? The code word for that is integrated deterrence. You will shortly see a national military strategy that's going to define what that means and explain it in more detail. Classified versions is out. Can't tell you about it. But the unclassified version will be out very shortly. So that's a little bit of a look. If I put it in quantitative terms from the OSD China Mill Power report, I'm not going to walk through this chart, but what you really see is, even if we're looking at the eastern and southern theaters, which are the ones closest to Taiwan, there's a big quantitative advantage. There's areas where China has bombers and transports, and Taiwan just doesn't have those types of capabilities. We'll talk a little bit about modernization, because this is where things are moving. PLA has modernized its doctrine. It's focused on training and fighting integrated joint operations, and especially the role of information, including space and cyber. Building up forces, I'm not going to talk through that. A focus on recruitment, promotion, education, and training of its personnel, especially its officer corps, and a major reform of the organizational structure. And we have a big, thick book that you can go to the NDU press website, search for my name, you'll find that big, thick book, which goes into detail. I'm just going to give you the highlights. And The big thing, actually, I'm only going to give you the most important highlight, which is number 4 on the slide. So this is the old PLA organization. And what you have here is uh, military regions, which are effectively Army regional commands. And the key problem with this is during war, those magically convert from an Army regional command to a war zone headquarters, which is a joint command entity. And the Army goes from just being in charge of the Army units inside their territory to now being in charge of the Air Force units, the Navy units, the Rocket Force conventional units. And if you don't train with those units and you don't practice that change, that's just an unworkable system for fighting joint conflict. So that's the big motivation for the reforms. There's other things going on. Let me go just really quickly. Number one, the Central Military Commission subsidiary organs, that's a joint staff, a real joint staff. Number 2, the military services. Now the Army has its own headquarters, but the important thing is they're no longer in charge of directing operations. Their job is to train and supply forces to the theater commanders. Number 3, the theater commanders, 5 of them, but these are now joint entities. So you have a theater commander and they train with the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Rocket Force all the time. The command structure is exactly the same as it would be in wartime. So they're ready to go. It's a much easier system and much better for doing joint operations. And then number 4, you have 2 new entities, Strategic Support Force, which brings your space, your cyber, your electronic warfighting capabilities, your information operations all under one roof and trying to get synergies there. And a joint logistics support force, which used to be the boring part of this briefing. Maybe it still is the boring part, but everybody who's looking at Ukraine knows how important that is today. I'm short on time. I'm just going to go down the middle part of that. So the Central Military Commission telling the military what to do, the Joint Staff Department in charge of the warfight, the theaters focused on operations in their theater, the Eastern Theater with responsibility for Taiwan, and having those service components there. Again, your strategic support force, joint logistics support force, giving you capabilities, the service headquarters giving you national level capabilities. And so that's a little wrinkle here that things like Air Force bombers or the paratroopers, those are national assets. They're still under Air Force control. And so in the Taiwan War, the center has to say what we want, and then the Air Force goes out and delivers that. That's also true of things like anti-ship ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, those kinds of capabilities. But the real point here is you got a joint command structure at the theater level, and it seems to be a workable one. And that helps your Taiwan operations. It helps with the strategic cyber capabilities. It helps with logistics. You've got a brigade and battalion structure, much more flexible, much more modular. You've standardized your amphibious brigades. Those are key players in a Taiwan fight. You've invested in helicopters, transport, and ships and aircraft, and tried to augment that with commercial assets. So a lot done that's helpful. Let me hit some of the key findings from the book. First is that a Chinese decision to use force is likely to be a deliberate, rational decision. It's going to focus on costs and risks, including the risk of inaction, and it'll think about both external and domestic considerations. And I really don't find credible the idea that it's going to be an accident or incident. And actually, nobody in Taiwan or China believes that either, that it's going to be an accident that escalates to war. But I also don't think they're going to be pressured into it by domestic things. The party has the ability to control the media, suppress protests. They demonstrate that when they want to. There's flexibility there because you can shift from our goal is to deter independence. We must do it today. Okay, and you go to bed and the job is done because Taiwan's not going to do that. So if you emphasize that, that's a goal you can achieve. If you say we got to achieve unification by a particular date, that's a much harder thing. And they've been careful not to set hard deadlines that might force their hand, because if you set a deadline, it turns into an ultimatum, and you've either got to back down if you're not ready and don't want to do it, or you might have to act when you think you're not ready and don't want to do it. That's a stupid thing to do, and PRC leaders have been careful not to do that. And the military's told them not to do that when Jiang Zemin was interested in this. Okay, second set of findings, I think prospects for peaceful unification are narrowing, and the PRC menu of military intimidation and warfighting options is expanding. We talked about some of those things, the gray zone. And I think the bottom line here is they can execute small island seizures. They can do a joint fire strike campaign. They can do blockade operations. Those things are not likely to be decisive. They've improved capabilities for the most demanding option, which is an invasion. Now, if we look at that, wholesale changes to try to get ready for this. The reforms improve the ability to do joint operations, reorganization of the Army into brigades and the Air Force into brigades as well. Does a lot of things to integrate space and cyber. That's how they want to fight. And specific forms of new hardware relevant to an invasion. So landing large dock amphibious ships, amphibious fighting vehicles, even tactical vehicles for the airborne corps. And those are specifically focused on Taiwan type operations. But still got a way to go. Still have not enough lift to do it. And it's not just getting the troops there. Once you get them there, you have to keep resupplying them, because there's nothing worse than landing troops somewhere and they're out of ammunition and they're out of food and they're stuck. So that airlift and sea lift capability is a real thing. Can they use commercial assets? Absolutely. But then you got to seize a commercial port. Then you got to seize airfields. You can't just fly, commercial airliner into a contested airship. You just can't do that. And so that points to something, if Taiwan can stop that, that's a really important thing. More a technical judgment, but going to a combined arms battalion as your basic maneuver unit, that's a tough thing. You got to have a battalion commander who knows how to command infantry and tanks and helicopters and special operation forces, and doesn't have a big staff to help him do all of those things. So that's a demanding task. How well are they going to do at it? Tensions in this joint command structure. So a big part of how the PLA wants to fight is they want to know what's going on, have information, use it, push it down to the lowest level. But their organizational culture is a top-down culture. And so it's great to have command and control that reaches down to the bottom, gets information there. But then the temptation is for the top to start meddling in operational decisions at a lower level. And the organizational culture is one of deference to authority, to tell me what to do, and I'll go do it. But the US military culture is tell me what it is that you want done, and I'll figure out how to go get it done. A very different approach. And that might mean they can't use the hardware investments as effectively as would be the case. Doctrine hasn't been updated to match the new organization and command and control arrangements. That's a work in progress. We're starting to see that rolled out. And then inadequate training for some of the key parts of this. So the amphibious forces don't do opposition force training. The airborne forces don't train with other parts of the PLA. They do a little bit of training for urban warfare, but what we see in Ukraine is that that's a really hard thing to do. It's a tough task. Last key finding is there's opportunities to exploit some of these weaknesses and to strengthen Taiwan's defenses. So the centralization, that is a weakness that can be exploited. Logistics are centralized and their networks are centralized. Well, if you can do things to mess with those networks, that impedes the PLA's ability to mobilize and sustain its forces. Taiwan has real opportunities here to invest in asymmetric capabilities such as mines, mobile air defense and strike, armed drones that really complicate the PLA's ability to execute an invasion. And of course, the US military is not standing still. We're exploring new systems and concepts that strengthen our ability to fight inside a Chinese anti-access area denial zone, and especially to conduct multi-domain operations on a global scale. So the thing that gets you if you're China might not be from inside the Indo-Pacific theater at all. Okay, so can't do a briefing on Taiwan these days without talking about lessons from Ukraine. And it's a subset of the lessons. One of them, I think, is the need to maintain momentum. Now, the Russians wanted a quick, decisive conflict. China wants a quick, decisive conflict for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to go into. If you get bogged down you start to be in trouble. So I think that's a lesson. For the PLA, that means you got to practice. You got to practice your mobilization. You got to practice what you're going to do in the campaign. And it's more important to figure out how to execute it than it is to mask what it is you're going to do. I would be my lesson from it. Importance of logistics, training, and morale. We saw all kinds of problems in the Russian force. There are lessons there for the PLA, but it's also possible they may decide, hey, we got this. We've already done this. We've modified our conscription system to be different and better. We've invested in building this joint logistics support force. We already put a lot of emphasis on political work to keep our soldiers motivated. They know to us. We don't have to make that case to them. So they may feel they've got it. At the tactical military level using portable SAMs, anti-tank weapons, armed drones to have a real resistance. Those are all systems Taiwan can use. They have some of them. But the point is, it's not just a matter of getting weapons. It's having troops, it's having reservists, it's having a militia that's mobilizable, that can operate them. In the case of Ukraine, once the balloon went up, you could still get stuff in because it has ground borders. In Taiwan, it's an island. Once the balloon goes up, you're only going to be delivering stuff maybe by submarine, and not that much you can put on a sub. Another big lesson, U.S. ability to mobilize coalitions and get support for a really, really tough sanctions regime. I think it really surprised Russia, but it also has to surprise China. And the implication is the economic and political costs of the conflict may be a lot higher than they thought. So you go back to what is that decision calculus, what's that deterrence calculus? And then finally, the critical role of political leadership and the ability to get the message out. And whether that's through YouTube or social media or the Ukrainian prime minister talking to people, that is critical in Ukraine's ability to rally support, to raise the costs from the Russians, to maintain domestic morale, to mobilize international support. And I think the lessons the PRC is going to draw is we got to stop that. Stop that's my quick take on the lessons. Let me get to my last two slides. So the near term, relax. Now, don't relax too much. But the PLA still is missing some capabilities that are necessary for successful invasion. And it's my view that the diplomatic, economic, and military costs and risks of resolving the threat with force still are high. You got to be prepared for the U.S. to intervene. That's a big fight. It's a fight with a nuclear armed country. Who knows where that's going to go? And I see the PRC leadership as more aggressive than in the past, but still rational and risk averse. And so are you going to put the credibility of the regime? Are you going to put your personal political survival at risk if this is an operation you're not sure you're going to be able to pull off? And even if the PLA tells you you're ready, do you believe those assurances? And that we can talk about that further. Again, I don't see nationalist pressure as likely to force Xi Jinping's hand. The biggest near-term risk I see is the PRC taking some kind of military action to reinforce its red lines against Taiwan independence. And what they see is a Taiwan and a U.S., for that matter, that sort of systematic Islami tactics to do a little bit more, a little bit closer to independence. Where is that red line where it becomes independence? And that's where I see the risk, where the U.S. and Taiwan think this is just a tiny thing, it's no big deal. And the PRC redefines where that red line is, or it is a big deal. And we've got to take military action to make sure you understand that it's a big deal and that you don't keep trying to do this. But I'm relatively sanguine for the near term. But over the long term, it's a big challenge because the PRC is determined to achieve unification. It's part of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. No explicit deadline and good reasons not to set one. We can talk about that in Q&A if people disagree. PLA is working hard to fill its capability gaps and position itself to win a conventional conflict with the U.S. military. Taiwan has a window to improve its military capabilities, but it's got to do more and it's got to be strategic in its choices. And that's a big debate in Taiwan. Do you focus on thwarting the invasion what was called the overall defense concept, sometimes talked about as innovative and asymmetric tactics, but basically saying if we lose that fight, we lose. And so put your attention to thwarting an invasion. That's the critical decisive thing. Or do you think, well, we got to be prepared for PRC aircraft incursions, we got to have traditional capabilities to defend Taiwan's sovereignty, and that's where the Taiwan military is more so than it is the focus on innovative, asymmetric, and focused on blocking an invasion. So there's opportunities there, but there's also a lot of work to be done. U.S. focus on integrated deterrence and new operational concepts, I think, is likely to help the U.S. win back some of that ground that has been ceded maybe in the conventional warfight. One of the things I worry about is what I call the net assessment challenge and the risk of misperception. So even with Ukraine, we have no real world examples of two modern militaries with the full suite of modern multi-domain capabilities, all your space and counter space and offensive cyber, all your information warfare capabilities, all your high-tech PGMs, putting all these things together. And the Chinese logic of it is if you use all these things together, you get synergies. It's more than the sum of the parts. And if you can put it all together in the right way, it's a really great thing. And you use that to go after your adversary, and you try to blind their ISR, you try to confuse their command and control, you try to break them into parts and make them fight on their own, and that really divides their combat power. So we get synergies, we multiply, we attack them, we divide their power. Problem is that's the US model for fighting this war as well. We can't both be right that we're going to get all these synergies and we're going to protect all of our assets. So I worry about that. There's a chance for misperceiving how good you are, how well you are going to do. And when you do the math, you think, yeah, maybe we got this. And then when you try to do it in practice, you find the friction of war, all the problems show up, and you're a lot less effective than you thought. So that risk of misperception, irrational choice, but based on bad information, based on bad assumptions. And ultimately, where we are today, I think, is that deterrence rests less on the US ability to deny the objective, to say we can clearly beat the PLA, and therefore they're not going to try. It rests more on the fact that it's going to be a really costly and risky thing. And do you want to roll the dice? We're betting that Xi Jinping doesn't want to roll those dice. And it's not just the costs, it's the escalation risks. Again, starts out conventional, where does it end at the end of the day? And then the last point I'm going to make, and I'm going to try to hit my mark of 30 minutes, is I think Taiwan is increasingly entangled in a broader US-China strategic competition. And for folks in Taipei, that may seem like a good thing because you're getting a lot stronger signals of US support, including military support, maybe than in the past. But it's not clear it's an unalloyed good thing, because that also means you are susceptible if the US wants to disentangle its economy somewhat from China in high-tech sectors. That's going to directly affect Taiwan's economy and Taiwan's high-tech firms. And so being caught in that broader strategic competition, I think there's a potential for Taiwan to get whipsawed. You sort of think you're going to get the best of all those things, but they go together, and some of those things might not be so good for Taiwan. So let me end there. Let's go to questions and answers. There we go.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Philip, for a really rich, insightful talk. And I wish we had 2 hours to cover all of this material that you've put on the table. Because we don't, I want to start with what's really the big question kind of looming in the background. And that is, what would actually trigger a PLA invasion of Taiwan? What's the political calculus here? And there's a school of thought that has gained prominence within some circles in the US in recent years that if the military balance tips pretty decisively in the PLA's favor, then Xi Jinping will give the order. And the only thing preventing him from waking up and giving the order these days is he doesn't have enough confidence that they can actually execute successfully. So if they are in a position in 3, 5, 10 years, where he does have that confidence, do you think that's a really dangerous moment then? Or what I'm gathering from your talk is that you disagree with that position, and I guess I'm inviting you to kind of elaborate on
I
that.
don't think it's an automatic decision, because what you wind up with in that kind of calculus is costs and risks. Costs are what you expect to pay, right? And so you can make that calculus, yeah, we think we do okay. We're going to take these kind of losses. That's an acceptable loss. We're going to take these kind of sanctions. Yeah, I'm good with that. I think if we do that on balance, it's still a decision that makes sense. The risks part is unaccountable. It's what if something goes wrong? What if we get out in the middle of the strait and a typhoon comes? What if the sea mines are a lot better than we thought they were going to be? What if the conflict escalates in ways that we didn't predict? Um, and so you have to account for those as well. And by definition, you sort of don't know for sure. So this gets partly into psychology. How do you calculate risk? It gets partly into prospect theory as a way of thinking about it, that you care more about holding on to what you have necessarily than what to gain. And in this part, the cost of failure, I think, is pretty significant. I don't think necessarily it brings down the Chinese Communist Party, but if you are the leader who pushed to do this thing and it blows up in your face, I can see there might be some pressure, if not for regime change, at least for leadership change. Uh, Maybe Khrushchev is an example that springs to mind. So it's not that's part of it as well. It's a personal gamble for Xi Jinping if he's the one in charge, and he's putting his personal political future. How eager are you to do that? So how much, and then that gets to the question, how much confidence do you need? What costs are you prepared to pay? What risks are you prepared to run? And it's clear that he's a more aggressive, assertive leader than in the past, but he still seems to me a pretty rational one, and in particular respects, risk averse. And I can think about it in different contexts, thinking about, say, South China Sea. That's a similar gray zone approach, trying to avoid the use of lethal force. And China stayed within that. They've been more aggressive in expanding control, but they haven't tried to go turf the Vietnamese off of the islands that they occupy. They haven't tried to seize them. So I think that's my answer. There's still a margin. It's a worse place to be. It's a much worse place to be because you're in that kind of margin where it's the cost of doing this, and it depends on what the Chinese leadership thinks. It'd be a lot better if we knew for sure they couldn't do it, but that's not where we are right now.
Right. In the interest of time, I'm going to pull a couple questions from the room. Let's start with Larry Diamond.
So I have a couple questions. One is, you said they still have a ways to go in order to develop the capacity to confidently launch an amphibious invasion. So how long is that ways? And then on the nuclear thing, I've talked to China experts who think, yes, Xi is rational, but he's also more in the vein of Maoist risk taking than his predecessors by far. And some have even pointed to Mao's warning to the US that, he could lose a few Chinese cities and the US would be destroyed. It might be rational for the Chinese to think that we would be much more averse to escalating to nuclear than they would, that they could win an eyeball to eyeball confrontation. What worries me about Ukraine is that Putin is thinking the same thing. I am not persuaded that the risk of nuclear escalation is something that they would particularly worry about. And in relation to their objectives, just one more thing. I think, his political situation may deteriorate dramatically in the next year or two. They are facing a crisis with COVID right now that is very, very dimly understood in the West. But Shanghai is like is completely shut down, and there are communities in Shanghai that resemble concentration camps in terms of their response to this. So uh, your talk, which was fantastic, was about what Taiwan might do that might precipitate this, which I worry about, or external things or so on. But there is the possibility as political needs will drive this.
Please go
Okay,
ahead.
well, I'll bang them out. How long? It depends on what the U.S. and Taiwan does. It is not, the gaps in PLA capabilities, the types of training they would have to do. The roadmap for that is pretty clear. It'll take probably, in my view, a couple years, because you want to have new doctrine, you want to train on it, you want to make sure you can execute everything that you want to do. But Taiwan's not necessarily standing still. The U.S. is certainly not standing still. So kind of what you need to do is clear, and it'll take a couple years, in my view. But it's what you don't know that you need to do, because Taiwan's improving defenses, the U.S. is improving defenses. The nuclear piece, we can talk about it in various ways. I don't see Xi in the same terms. But let me take the strong argument, which is Putin deterred the U.S. Right? He made nuclear threats, and the U.S. very quickly said, "We're not going to intervene. We're not going to get involved." And my explanation for that would be that you just had to do that for political reasons, because the U.S. stakes in Ukraine are limited. And in order to build this coalition, in order to rally support for sanctions, the administration had to take that option of direct conflict with Russia off the table in order to do what they did diplomatically and economically. And for me, the stakes in Taiwan are higher. And it's not just a question of who cares more about Taiwan. The U.S. stakes are a little bit different. It's about the U.S. regional position. It is about the credibility of U.S. alliances. And this is the region of the world that matters most to the United States in the future. We've got to have economic access, and our political position, our military position helps underpin that. Now, so we're not going to have the same kind of military dominance we used to have. But in my view, economic access to Asia is critical. And if it's a China-dominated region, that's one where that can't be guaranteed. So I think the U.S. stakes in Taiwan are actually a lot higher, and therefore worth bearing more risk. And then finally, Xi's political situation major. I agree with that, and I agree. Part of that's COVID. I think there's other things going on economically where he's centralizing power and authority in ways that may be counterproductive. But I'm not one who believes in diversionary war. I've got an unpublished paper which kind of goes into detail on this. And my reading of the evidence is when the situation gets bad internally in China, what you see is an effort to stabilize the external situation, not to take actions that divert attention and make it worse. So that's my reading of the history. I know Erin Carter is here. She's got a different take on it. But let's go to the next set.
Okay, Misha,
I want that debate.
you want that?
I'll step down. Phil is a great talk as always, and like Larry, I have lots of political questions, but I'll put those aside because the focus and obviously your work is on the military side. Just really two interrelated questions. One was to ask you a little bit. You had in one of the slides that the U.S. still has a quantitative advantage over the PLA, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, it's I don't have to go into it. You understand the question.
Yep.
Second is also related to the U.S. and it's two parts. First is what is the training? What you gave us was primarily, as I interpreted, was on PLA going into Taiwan. But what is the training that they're doing with all of the reforms on training for U.S. intervention, or is the presumption military intervention, or is the presumption we're not going to intervene? And I guess there's a scale. There's what we're doing in Ukraine versus Seventh Fleet goes in. Connected with that, then is this. Where does that fit into this scale of what you were talking about? Meaning, Do they see it? This is at the front end. Do they see there's going to be a 2-week window? I mean, what are you picking up from their view on when it becomes a much broader fight than just the island itself?
Sure.
Thank you.
So quantitative advantage, I think, it has to do with what's in theater and what's outside. If you look at the total U.S. military, we have a lot more capability there. The question is, can you get it there, and how quickly can you get it there? So that is what drives the PRC toward wanting a rapid campaign, wanting to campaign with what's in place. The longer it goes, the more the U.S. can deploy things from other theaters. And in fact, that's, in my view, the key dilemma is you have a crisis start, the U.S. gets worried. Do we start flowing forces to have options maybe before the president has decided or built the political support to intervene? So that's something I worry a lot, because the military says, Mr. President, we need to start deploying stuff so so we can give you options, give us permission to start doing it. And maybe Washington isn't there yet with its decision about whether to intervene or how to intervene, or, as you suggest, what levels. But the longer it goes, the more the U.S. can bring forces from further away to bear. And the other part is China doesn't have complete freedom to move everything to the Eastern Theater. It's part of this reorganization. You've got 5 different theater commands. My colleague Joel Wuthno's done a great study called System Overload, which talks about how can the U.S. create problems for China in other parts of the world, where now all of a sudden you want the Western theater to stay at home because you're worried about India, or you're worried about Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or you're worried about other things. So, I think there is a quantitative advantage, but the problem is it takes the U.S. a long time to get it there. You make a broader point about kind of what does the PLA expect. That was their lesson from '96, is you got to plan on the U.S. intervening, and you got to be prepared for it. And from that point, they started building capabilities and planning on how to respond to that. Now, of course, the hope is, you deter the United States from intervening in the first place, and they take a pass. And if you do, it's a much easier fight if it's just Taiwan. But you can't count on that. So you've got to be ready and prepared. And that's, in fact, a key Chinese decision point, is if the U.S. hasn't firmly committed to intervene, do you start striking U.S. air bases? Do you start launching a campaign against Guam and Tokyo, or not Tokyo, but Yokosuka, and trying to deny the U.S. the ability to do it, even if they haven't yet committed to intervene? And the PLA doctrine, they want to seize the initiative. They want to act early. They want to maybe even act first. So that's a big challenge for the United States. Again, this all drives them to wanting a quick campaign before the U.S. can fully mobilize and get forces there. But that's a lesson of the Ukraine. You want the momentum, you want to get in and get it over with, but you can't count on that. The friction of war is such that things are always harder than they seem. They always take longer than they seem. And you can't just say, well, everything will go well. We got it. The question is going to be, well, what if it doesn't go well? And that, to turn that around, then for Taiwan and the United States, that's part of the calculus. How do you present the PLA with new challenges? And in the run up to a crisis, how do you unveil a new capability? And it's in the press, and the next thing you know, it's in reference news, and the civilian leaders see it, and they call their generals in and say, hey, I read about this thing in reference news. What are we doing to stop this? And hopefully they don't have good answers on what they're going to do to stop it. So I hope that's somewhat receptive. And that is the problem. If you get into a longer campaign, then you have economic vulnerabilities on the PRC side. So yes, they have stockpiles of oil and natural gas and spare parts and things like that, but it's limited in time. And I think basically the view is they're going to mobilize for war, and they're going to shut down a lot of the commercial side of their business. You're not going to be exporting things via sea through the middle of a war zone. How long can you endure that? You don't want to endure it for a long time, but if it turns into a longer war, you have to. So I think those are all reasons that push them for a short, decisive conflict. And if you're not sure you can deliver that, maybe you win. Maybe you think you can win, a war that goes 2 or 3 years. The cost calculus is very different than that kind of war.
Thanks. I'll just say, my colleague here, Russell Berman, and I wrote on opening up second fronts, and so we'll send that over to you. But exactly to your point, how do you complicate Beijing's decision-making calculus? So thanks.
Great. I'm going to take one more question from the table here, and then I promise we'll get to the online audience. We've got a ton of great questions coming in.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to the cover of the book. I'm not quite sure how you represent that thesis graphically, but it'll be interesting.
It's a landing craft and the PLA running out on the beach. So that's the graphic illustration.
Okay. I'd like you to contextualize post-reform PLA and the skirmish in India on the borders there, and what less I thought you did a great job of giving us an analysis of how they perhaps in Beijing have taken lessons from Ukraine. But what did they take from that particular skirmish, and do they consider it a win, loss, or a draw?
Boy, that's a good question. Part of what they take from it is things they did right, that they built a logistics infrastructure that let them project power to the border. And that's sort of a proximate cause of those tensions. The Chinese started doing this earlier, before the Indians did. The Indians have finally started matching this. But that's such unpleasant, unfavorable, high altitude, difficult terrain that the logistics and how you get combat power to the border, to the front lines, and sustain it is really critical for that kind of war fighting. Not least, that's a lesson of the 1962 war for the India. They deployed troops there, and they had altitude sickness. They couldn't fight effectively until they acclimatized to the altitude. So I think one of the lessons there is the logistics piece of it. Part of it is local command and ways in which they have improved their power projection capabilities. But in this case, the Indians pushed back on it. And it's interesting, just as an aside, part along that part of the border, there's an agreement not to use certain types of weapons. So this wound up being a skirmish that was fought with clubs and knives rather than guns and artillery, which is really, kind of interesting if you think about escalation and things like that. I guess I would think about it as both sides had sort of limited stakes and limited objectives, and that's part of what lets you keep it under wraps. How did the Chinese think they did? The Indians think they did well. They think they pushed back successfully. Yeah, I'm not sure how the Chinese think they did. They might have thought it would be easier and more successful, and from that perspective, didn't achieve what they wanted. But I am struck, and again, I'm in Silicon Valley. I'll say, Neil Stephenson's latest book has a really, really interesting take on this, where he talks about performative war and having this stuff be on social media and a betting network on it. I love authors that really speculate about this, and I found that a fascinating part of his book. And he captures something which is, this is not an existential issue for either side. It's more tied into domestic politics and the value of territory, and therefore there are limits on how far you can go. And maybe that's why it's a conflict with bats and knives rather than other things.
All right. I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative since we've got so many good questions coming in. I'm going to extend our time for another 10 minutes. We were originally supposed to end here at 12:30, but we'll go to about 12:40 to give you a chance to respond. So the questions coming in, I put in 3 buckets here. One is about semiconductors. And in fact, let's start with that. So what's the role of the just massive dependence of the United States and other Western economies on semiconductors that are manufactured in Taiwan, both in terms of the US calculus in responding potentially to a threat to Taiwan, and also the PRC's calculus about whether the US would respond? Do you see the dependence on semiconductors as potentially a stabilizing force or a destabilizing force across the strait?
Stabilizing And the start for that is the PRC is equally dependent on semiconductors. That's about half of their imports, I believe, from Taiwan are semiconductors. That's critical to their manufacturing economy. And so if you disrupt that, that's a major economic disruption. I mean, we sort of seen it with COVID and shortages in semiconductors, and we see, how that affects the price of your automobile and how much you're paying over, so these things are connected. But the first point is that the PRC is also dependent on this, and trying to solve it with force is very disruptive for a big chunk of Chinese industry. Now, that's a short-term disruption. Do you think, okay, it's 6 months or it's a year, we're willing to pay that price? But it is a big price. And part of what that means is you have voices inside China who are saying, not now, let's be careful, let's not mess this up. And it's not just the state-owned enterprises that are importing the stuff. It's the provincial party secretaries who are counting on economic growth to help them get their seat on the Politburo. So for the U.S., that's another reason why we have stakes in what happens in Taiwan. It is a question, whether if China gets hold of that and can replicate that capability, but that's harder to do than it seems. First, because the factories are probably going to be rubble in the course of the conflict. Second, that a lot of the knowledge is kind of intangible and it's tied up in particular experts. So do you get the particular experts? You can even imagine sort of a case of trying to evacuate nuclear scientists in the early days of World War I to keep them out of the hands, or actually after World War II, in the case of missile scientists, to keep them out of the hands of the Germans or the Soviet Union. So maybe the very key workers there, maybe, those are people you want on the planes going out of Taiwan in the middle of it. So I think it gives the U.S. stakes, additional stakes here, and I think it is a factor that deters a Chinese decision to use force.
Okay. The second set of questions fall into this kind of implications from Ukraine for the potential Taiwan scenario. And you touched on it a bit in one slide, but I'd like to invite you to expand a little bit, particularly the poor Russian performance in executing their Ukraine campaign. What impact do you think that has on PLA planners, on their efforts to modernize and engage in particular, joint force fighting?
That's a great question. The PLA looks to the United States and Russia as models of how modern militaries fight. And they're explicit. They want to learn from both of those countries. That's partly what they're doing in their mill-to-mill relations. The U.S. is very careful on that. The Chinese say, we want to do conventional mill-to-mill things with you. And we're like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want you to learn anything from us. So it's a matter of both of law, but also of policy. And being somebody involved in U.S.-China military contacts, I can attest that, that is very rigorously adhered to. So it forces China to look a little bit more to Russia, and they look at them as the big brother, somebody who knows how to do this. They've done it in mill-to-mill competitions. They've done it through their participation in the major Russian joint force exercises. And for one of them, they sent the head of NDU, my boss's counterpart, who trained at the Russian General Staff Academy and speaks Russian, was part of that exercise. And the point is that they thought the Russians had figured it out. And in restructuring their military on this core brigade battalion model, that is how the US Army and Marines have done it. We've walked back a little bit of that, but it's how the Russians reorganized their military as well. And so I think the Chinese looked up to them as a more advanced, more capable military, and the poor performance calls that into question. Did the Russians have it figured out? And if we're looking to the Russians to teach us how to do it and they don't have it figured out, maybe that's a problem. So I think it calls some of that stuff into doubt. It probably will put more of a premium on them rethinking doctrine a little more independently, a little more focus on exercises and trying to test things out and be sure they're confident with it. And that is part of in the reforms, they say, we think we have the solution. We think we know what a brigade should look like, but we recognize that might not be perfect and we might have to adjust it. So I think it calls those things into question, and will make them think twice about it. And as they're crafting their next generation of joint doctrine, which again is starting to roll out, that process will probably be delayed. And to the extent if what you need is a PLA that's figured out how it wants to fight and has trained its units in how to fight that way, if that is a precondition for launching a successful invasion, that throws the timeline back a couple years, at least.
All right. The final set of questions are all in this bucket about U.S.-Taiwan coordination. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how much further the United States and Taiwan can go to improve joint training, joint potential doctrine, procurement, and additional issues to improve our ability to deter a PLA attack.
Okay, so this is definitely in the personal views category. Everything I said is, but this stuff definitely is. We can do more if we don't talk about it. So I don't think it's a good idea to publicize what we are doing. And there's domestic political incentives in the US and Taiwan to do so, but I think the governments have to be disciplined and the militaries have to be disciplined, because if you publicize it, if it's in the newspapers, it forces China to react. So that's kind of a first principle. The second thing, and this will be controversial and get me into trouble, is the legacy of US training for the Taiwan military is not all good.
Yeah.
We train to fight conventional wars from a position of material superiority and technological superiority. And that is not the position that Taiwan is going to find itself in. So to some degree, we're training Taiwan to fight a conventional war when what they need to be prepared to do is fight unconventionally and outside traditional military structures. So sort of the joke is, well, we ought to, get the Serbians in to train them, and because they know what it's like to fight when you don't have air superiority. It may be the case if the Ukraine conflict turns out well, maybe we need Ukrainian trainers. Now, that said, some of that skill set is inside the US military in particular parts, and that is partly why the Ukrainian resistance is doing so well, is they have received some of that training. So some of those same things can be applied in Taiwan. But there's resistance inside the Taiwan military to this focus, that the Taiwan services want traditional platforms. The overall defense concept, innovative and asymmetric, is about smaller systems. And it's taking advantage of the fact that we know where the PLA has to come. There's only a couple beaches they can come. There's only a couple times a year they can come. You have a limited part of the area that you have to really protect and be able to attack the invading forces when they come to you. So to me, that makes a lot of sense, to really focus on those things, knowing you're not going to have air superiority, knowing your missile defenses are going to go down the first day of the war, knowing your ISR and command and control are going to be really problematic given PLA attacks. It makes sense to me to think, how are you going to fight in smaller unit ways, leverage mobile systems, shoot and scoot, and be hard for the PLA to destroy using their precision strike capabilities. But that's a very different way of fighting. Now, frankly, I think it's something the US knows something about, but needs to know more about, because that's part of the challenge of operating an anti-access area denial environment, is you're vulnerable. If you're sitting, and especially if you're sitting and transmitting, that is an invitation, put a missile on me. And so we have to learn to operate differently. I think the US services are getting on that challenge in their own different ways. Wasn't time and space to talk about it here today. But again, watch what the national military strategy says. So those are lessons where the US needs to figure knows some of it, but needs to figure more of it out. That to me is a really intriguing possibility. Is Taiwan as a laboratory for figuring this out? And that's kind of a really interesting way to think about it. And then I'll say something else controversial. With respect to arms sales, kind of the operating assumption has been just the US administration just has to have the guts. You have to have the guts to sell Taiwan what it needs and take the guff from the PLA and from China. And that's what it is. It's just guts. But that's not the case because Taiwan isn't spending as much on defense as it should. And when it does, it's thinking about balancing those conventional platforms with some of these asymmetric things. Maybe it's time for Congress to think about this a little bit differently. Maybe there is scope for aid where it's not just about the guts to sell Taiwan stuff, it's helping them find ways to afford to buy it. And that might help with some of the internal resistance as well, because if the military sees this coming, zero-sum game, it's conventional systems or it's these smaller things, the resistance is stronger if it is money added on to make things possible and it's not coming out of the conventional budget. That might be a very different dynamic. Not the only thing that has to be solved, but it could be a very different dynamic. So there's a couple ideas on the table about how we could do this a little differently.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for a real tour de force today. If you've joined us late, this is the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. I'm Karis Templeman. I'm the program manager of our project, and we've been listening to Philip Saunders from National Defense University here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and I hope you'll join us again soon for our next event.